the Lord. Welcome today to Francis and Friends. We have a very special program planned for you today, and we have a very special guest that's going to be with us today, someone that's never been on Sun Life Broadcasting with us before, and I am looking forward to this interview today. But first, I'm going to welcome Jim Nations to the program. I told Jim right before the program started, I said, well, Jim, it's you and I today. I said, the panel members come and they go, but you and I always are here. And he said, yes, thank the Lord.
Yes,
so, Jim, it's good to have you with us today.
It's always great, Sister Francis, to be a part of this program and with you, to be on with you, and it's an honor, and to be able to share what we're sharing with the world.
That's exactly.
And what we're going to be dealing with today, and our guests, the people are very interested. I get a lot of emails about the Common Core thing, yes.
It's very confusing to a lot of
people.
Yes, it is. It's extremely important for this country that we understand what Common Core exactly is and it's all about. And having said that, I'm going to welcome Alex Newman to the program today. Alex is an educator and an international journalist, and he writes for numerous publications in the United States as well as abroad. He also teaches advanced economics to high school students through Freedom Project Education. He's co-authored the book Crimes of the Educators, which I just found out about yesterday, and I'll give anything if I'd had a chance to read it before this interview today, but I didn't have, but I've read a lot about Alex and his writings. And I think he's going to be an extremely informative guest and good for our listeners here at Sun Life Broadcasting. And having introduced Alex and his book, Crime of the Educators, he's joining us today from Miami, Florida. And Alex, it's such a pleasure to have you with us on Sun Life Broadcasting today.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
And this is the first time, let me say, I've gotten to speak with Alex. As I said, I was doing some research yesterday concerning Common Core, and Alex, let me share with you that almost all of this week we have been dealing with Common Core, that the educational curriculum that's being used in our schools all over the country, and especially the new aspect of it concerning the mental health screening that is taking place in the schools. And as I understand, it may not have been introduced in some schools yet. Some schools it has been introduced into, and we have been dealing primarily with that because as Christians, this concerns us greatly here at Sun Life Broadcasting because we realize the ramifications that screening for mental health. And as the more that I looked into it, the more that I studied it, I was seeing what are they looking at concerning mental health. And I found out it's the attitudes. It's actually the makeup of a child. And if you don't think like the federal government, I can use those terms, wants you to think because they're the ones that are setting the guidelines for this mental health screening, then they can declare you as having mental health issues. We have been discussing that now. In the past, we have discussed Common Core through every phase of it. I've had a panel of educators that has been with us on the program, and incidentally, I'm going to be having some of those back, trying to help this explain this to our audience. And so your book, Crimes of the Educators, that you helped to co-author is just simply fantastic, what I've read about it, and I cannot recommend it enough to our listeners. But if they want to go and look you up and purchase that book, how would they go about doing it?
It's available through the publisher at WND Books, so people can go to the WND Superstore. It's also available on Amazon, and at least you can order it online through all the major retailers, Target, Walmart, Barnes & Noble. So, pretty much a search engine will be able to point you in the right direction.
Okay. How long have you had the book out, Alex?
It was actually just released last week on Tuesday, so we're really excited that it's out there. I mean, the information is just so critical, and that's why I agreed to take on this project. It's just so important that parents understand what's going on, and it's been out for a week, and so far we've had a lot of success with it. hope and pray that we can get this information out there before it's too late.
You and I both. And so let's begin today with Common Core. I know you mentioned that in the information that I was reading concerning about this goes back to John Dewey. But in our research, we even went further back than John Dewey. And this has been in the process. And it had to be done very slowly so that the masses of people, the moms, the dads, and the people in the schools would not really understand what the federal government is actually doing. They're trying to nationalize our school system, and in fact, I think I could say internationalize our school system to where in every country, in every word, in every state, every country, town, city, village, that the Common Core standards are being taught. Now, I'm going to open up the microphone, and I want you to share with the people everything that you know concerning Common Core, how you became involved in it, because I want to pull it all out of you today.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Frances. You're absolutely right. This goes beyond even nationalization of our education system. And the people behind this have been fairly upfront about what they're doing. The media has just failed in its job in terms of reporting this. But this is really globalizing the education system. You have the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the UNESCO, openly pushing exactly what's going on here. For example, they've developed a World Core curriculum, which is not necessarily Common Core, but they come from the same kind of mindset. This was developed by Robert Mueller, the Undersecretary General of the United Nations. And the idea was that this would form a kind of core of all the knowledge that people need to have, that the United Nations considers people need to have. And, a brief background on Robert Mueller. He was a very bizarre character. I think Christians would be extremely alarmed to learn about this guy. Just, a few little facts. He was a self-described disciple of Alice Bailey. She was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. He viewed the United Nations as this sort of divine institution that was going to lead humanity toward this consciousness shift and evolution. And so that's where this is all going. Now, if we go back in time, you're absolutely right that this begins even before John Dewey. But John Dewey was such a critical player that Sam Blumenfeld, my co-author, and I devoted a significant amount of space to his work, because he was really, he's often called the godfather of the progressive education movement. And even the progressive education schools that we have all across the country today. And he was pretty... Go ahead. Yeah,
let me interrupt you. Alice Bailey, is that the name I understood you to say?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes, that was the...
Okay, so in Christian circles, we look at her as a New Ager.
And that's exactly correct. She would allow herself to be possessed by these... she called them ascended masters. She had one in particular... Yes. She was very fond of, the Tibetan, she called him. Mm-hmm. They sound very much like demons. It sounds very much like demonic possession. But these entities would write books through her. She had one, Education and the New Age. And so another one was Externalization of the Hierarchy. Right. And her idea was to kind of move the world toward a single global religion, all ruled under the United Nations. A very, very frightening system, especially for Christians, but, for anybody out there. Nobody sends their kids to school to be indoctrinated into these kind of loony ideas, whether they're secular or Christians.
That's right.
A brief background on her. Anybody can just look on a search engine. Who was Alice Bailey? Who was Robert Mueller? And, if you're not alarmed, you're just not paying attention.
So she believed Spirit spoke to her, and through automatic writing, that's how she wrote her books and got her inspiration. Is that correct? Through these spirits. Yeah. See, that's demon spirits, what you said right there. So we find the background for this is actually in demon spirits.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite interesting.
And the UNESCO has been on this for, since its founding in the 1950s. Its very first Secretary General, Julian Huxley, he was very explicit about what he wanted to do. He said, we need to shield the kids from the beliefs of their parents. This is not suitable for a world collectivist society. He said he wanted kind of a global culture based on humanism. And John Dewey, of course, was a big proponent of humanism as well. He was one of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto. So make no mistake, they're teaching religion in the schools. It's just not the true religion. So, the claim that we have to keep church and state and school all separate, that's fine and dandy, but that's not what's going on. They're certainly teaching religion to the children. It's just a very different religion than, say, Western civilization has had, than the founders envisioned. And John Dewey, actually, this was one of his goals. He grew up a Christian, but he was no longer fond of his beliefs and his heritage. And he set out to turn America into a socialist utopia. And he was pretty frank about this. He went over to the Soviet Union and he came back saying what a great education system they had. And so he wanted to turn Americans into little socialists. He even told us kind of what his vision was. He pointed to Edward Bellamy's 1888 novel, Looking Backward. And this was a vision of a socialist, communist, utopian America in the year 2000. And he thought this was swell. He wrote that, if Americans would just read this book with an open mind, they would see how great socialism is. And we don't need any of this biblical religion and private property rights, and, everything that America was supposed to be based on. And so he set out in a very methodical way to tear down the underpinnings of the system that existed. And, he didn't work alone. He got a lot of funding from the Rockefeller family, for example. And he had a lot of colleagues in the education colleges and behavioral psychologists and so on. And they set about destroying the literacy of the American people. And they actually wrote that they were planning to do this. One of the essays that we republished in the book, just because it's so important, was by John Dewey. It's called The Primary Education Fetish. And he argued that, all this emphasis on teaching kids to read and to write and to do math, that's just silly in this day and age. We need to move past that. And kids need to be properly socialized, and they need to focus on social activities. Reading is so individual. So they set about promoting this, I call it a quack reading methodology. And it was known to be quackery even back then. They had done experiments with it in the 1800s. And they knew that you couldn't properly teach the overwhelming majority of the people how to read using this method, which is precisely why they chose to push it. Just a brief summary of it. I don't want to dwell on it for too long. We cover it very extensively in the book.
No,
but there's a lot of... Go ahead.
No, I want you to go ahead. Your information's excellent. Thank you. Okay,
thank you. So they have a lot of terms to kind of disguise what they're doing here. They call it the look-say method, the whole word method, the sight method of reading. These are all the same thing. What they're doing is, rather than teaching children to read the phonetic way, we have a phonetic alphabet. So the way you read our alphabet is by understanding the phonetic sounds that every letter makes and how they work together, and then decoding the word. They were teaching children to read as if English were Chinese, quite literally. You're supposed to look at the word as a whole word, as a symbol, like you would a Chinese character, and then kind of extract the meaning from there. Rather than reading it, you're looking at a symbol and associating that symbol in your memory with some kind of concept or some kind of, object or whatever the case may be. And they knew this didn't work. It clearly doesn't work. We have, solid evidence that this has failed miserably. In 1993, the federal government did a literacy study, and they found that 55% of American adults could barely read. Now, it's been 20 years since then. Undoubtedly, the situation is even more dire at this point. So by destroying the literacy of the American people, they figured this would be the best way to move us towards socialism. And they decided to do that with this quack reading method. And they've been wildly successful. They infiltrated the teaching colleges. They had their behavioral psychologist buddies promote this nonsense as if it was, legitimate pedagogy to teach children. And, they even fancied themselves experts and educators and more knowledgeable than the rest of us. And they knew that, if parents understood what was going on, if teachers understood what was going on, there would be a revolt. In that same essay that I mentioned by Dewey, he explains that change must come gradually. If to push it too quickly would favor a violent reaction and would jeopardize its ultimate success. So he knew that if the public figured out what they were doing here, there would be a violent reaction, just like there always has been in all societies when utopians and central planners try to take over the machinery of government and society. And, this was a very dangerous idea. And we see the fruits of it all around us today. People cannot read properly. They wonder why they can't read. They tell them they have a reading disability. Or we can go to what you were saying about the psychological profiles they're building. They say things like, your child has dyslexia, or your child has ADHD. Now they need powerful drugs. Let's give them amphetamines, which is essentially legal cocaine. It's, these are extreme drugs they're pushing on the kids. And by destroying the literacy of the American people, they've managed to destroy the foundations of society. People learned how to read in early America around the turn of the 19th century when John Dewey was coming up with this quackery, because they wanted to, everybody needed to learn how to read the Bible, for example. That was crucial. The Bible, the Word of God, is the foundation of all knowledge. Scripture tells us this. So if you can prevent people from reading the foundation of all knowledge, you can fill their head with total nonsense. And that's what we're seeing today. They couldn't read their Constitution, so they would have no idea, the Declaration of Independence. How can you protect what you don't even understand? We're losing, all of our God-given rights, as the founders called them. And people don't even understand what they're losing because they don't even have the ability to properly read and understand, the foundation of all of this. And so the program has been wildly successful. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan put together a commission, the National Commission on Educational Excellence. And they said if a foreign power had imposed this lunatic education system on our country, we would have considered it an act of war. So it was that serious that, hey, this is a big problem. If a foreign power had done this, we would have considered it an act of war. As it stands, Americans largely imposed this system on us. And now we're moving this to the global level. They're using our tax money to promote this quackery all over the world. They're using the UNESCO to promote the notion of that every country needs national standards, national tests aligned to those national standards. And of course, the national standards should be in conjunction with all of the international stuff that's going on at UNESCO. And Bill Gates, the primary financier of Common Core, believe it or not, he put about $2 billion of his own money into developing and promoting this Common Core educational system. He signed an agreement with UNESCO in 2004 to develop all kinds of educational resources and tools and a master curriculum and all sorts of things like this. So the connections are all there. And the UNESCO is very frank about what they're doing. But I would like to talk about Common Core a little bit, because I know this is, a huge topic today.
Yes,
parents are upset, teachers are upset, everybody's upset. Every legislature in the country is, being inundated with calls from parents and teachers and taxpayers saying, what is going on here? And they should be. This is an extremely serious problem we have on our hands here. It began long ago. The Bill Clinton administration played a role in developing the foundations for this. Then George Bush with the No Child Left Behind. Then we had the Obama administration that bribed all the state governments to impose this Common Core standards on all the schools. Now, the background of this is that you had the National Governors Association. Now, people mistakenly think that because we have the National Governors Association involved, that this is a state project. People need to understand what the NGA is. And then there was another group, the National Council of Chief State School Officers. And so people think, well, this must be a state-led initiative. And that's what the Common Core promoters have been arguing. But if you look at these organizations, you'll find that they're not states at all. They are trade associations based in Washington, D.C., funded by the federal government. Same thing with the testing regime that they've developed to align with Common Core. This is funded by the federal government. So this is not a state-led project. It virtually across the country, maybe with a few exceptions, this was imposed without even the knowledge or the consent of the state legislature, much less the people of the state. It came in all through the back door. And when I started looking at it in 2010, 2011, nobody had heard of Common Core. It was underway. It was being developed, but nobody knew what it was. If you asked a person on the street, they would have no clue what you were talking about. Then in about 2013, they finally announced it. They said, hey, everybody has Common Core now. It's already in your state. If you don't like it, too bad. It's here. It's going to stay.
Well, that's where I want to ask a question, because you mentioned that, people worldwide are upset about it, especially in the United States of America, parents, teachers, and it's just such a load on the teachers. I don't even understand how there's time left for them to teach a class. It's obviously not. But at the same time that everybody is discussing it, and I'm saying everybody because there's a lot of people that don't even know about it, and many parents that don't know what's happening to their children in the schools, but they are beginning to see things and get concerned about it. But how widespread is the knowledge of parents and educators that are really understanding what this curriculum called Common Core is all about? And versus because the federal government is just pushing it in the schools. I know here in Louisiana, our governor general has taken a strong stand against it, but it's still being pushed and promoted by the federal government, and we see that big business is behind this. And I like here in Baton Rouge and in the city that I live in, all the business leaders are pushing for this Common Core to be in the schools. What do they have to gain from it?
That's an excellent question. I think the first thing to understand is why, even with the uproar, this is still here. We've had a number of states even repeal it and try to back out of it, and still Common Core remains. I can't tell you how many teachers I've talked to, even in states where the Common Core has supposedly been banned, who say, hey, they're still implementing Common Core. I can't do this. I will not, in good conscience, subject my students to this kind of lunacy. It's incorrect reading methods. It's incorrect methods to learn how to do math. And so what the federal government has done here, and the Gates Foundation, is set up a system of incentives where it becomes very close to impossible to get out of this now. During the economic crisis, Obama insisted that we needed a stimulus program, and he demanded that Congress give him, almost $1 trillion for stimulus. And he did a lot of things that, are dubious and questionable with that money. And one of those things was to put aside billions of dollars to, I call it bribing, because as far as I'm concerned, that's what it is. They're taking our tax money, or even, borrowing money from China, or just printing it at the Federal Reserve. And then they're giving it to our state governments, and they say, hey, you can have this federal funding if you impose Common Core. They don't use the word Common Core. They say college and career ready standards, and there's only one set of those. It's Common Core. And if you want the federal money, you need to do that. And otherwise, teachers are going to be fired. The state education bureaucracy is going to be reduced, and so on. So you have this built-in incentive in the bureaucracy. Hey, we can't get rid of this because then we're going to lose our federal funding, and then we're going to be in trouble. Some of us are going to be out of a job. And then the Gates money is extremely important. I think people underestimate it. $2 billion is an unfathomable amount of money. I mean, that's more than the GDP of a lot of small countries. This is a huge, huge amount of money. And what the Gates Foundation has done is they've bought off teachers' unions in many cases. The teachers hate this. If there's been surveys of them, I've talked to many of them. They say it's terrible. But the teachers' unions in many cases have been bought off with Gates money. A lot of the think tanks, especially those focused on education, received huge grants from the Gates Foundation to push this. And even, political campaigns, legislatures, all kinds of institutions are out there now getting money to promote Common Core, to sell Common Core, and so on. And then if you look at the organizations that developed it, you find maybe some of the information on why the big business community is so much behind it. The National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers got together, and they hired an organization called Achieve Inc. Now, this is supposed to be a nonprofit organization dedicated to, wonderful education and all these kinds of nice things. If you look at it, you'll see that it is dominated by, the establishment, not just the education establishment, but the real establishment. To give you an example, the head of it, he's now the president emeritus, I believe. He was the former CEO of IBM. Now, he is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's been a regular attendee at the Bilderberg meetings, and he has a lot of influence in the business community. So these are very, very powerful people who have an agenda. And he told us part of his agenda in a column for the Wall Street Journal before Common Core. He wrote this in 2008, and he said, we need to just get rid of local school districts. We just need to move toward a national education system. The local school districts, this notion that we need to have local control of our schools is archaic. Let's just move toward a single national system, and that's going to solve all our problems. Now, that's absurd in my view for a number of reasons. First of all, because it's unconstitutional, but just from a pragmatic point of view, I talk about putting all your eggs in one basket, right? We know that competition works well, where the best ideas rise to the top. And so when you have a situation where you have all these different school districts trying different things, competing with each other for students, state governments trying to develop the best policies, you do end up getting good policies. When you impose a single one-size-fits-all plan on the whole nation, you get all sorts of problems. And with the Common Core, we're seeing that. And if we look at the content of Common Core, this should be incredibly alarming to everyone too, not just Christians. I mean, even secular parents, even liberal parents, progressive parents, they don't send their kids to school to become, as Arnie Duncan calls them, the education secretary. He says that schools are now training up generations of green citizens to fulfill their roles, their green jobs, and the new green world order that they're building. He's saying this openly in speeches to the UNESCO, to sustainability summits, and the speeches are posted on the Department of Education's website. So they're not being shy about this. But just from an academic point of view, I think just one crucial piece of evidence really lays to rest the notion that these standards are going to improve education or anything like that. The Common Core team, shall we say, they put together what they call the validation committee, the Common Core validation committee. And this was supposed to be kind of a rubber stamp process, right? They were just going to put their seal of approval on it, and everybody was going to know that Common Core was great. They put two subject matter experts, just two, on this committee. One was Dr. Sandra Stotsky. She's an expert in English language arts. And after reviewing the standards, she said, no way, I'm not going to sign off on this. This is going to reduce the critical thinking abilities of children. And now that's important, parents. They're trying to reduce the critical thinking abilities of your children. Now, you can figure out why, I think, on your own. She said they're removing all of the classic literature, all the great works of fiction, everything that's come down through us, just through the centuries is being removed, and it's being replaced with absolute nonsense. The kids are going to be reading executive orders from President Obama. They're going to be reading EPA regulations on insulation levels in people's roofs. And then they're supposed to, try to decode these things and figure out what they mean. So this is just absurd. And Dr. Sandra Stotsky, who's not opposed to national standards per se, I'm opposed to those philosophically, whether they were good or not. But she's not opposed to the idea of national standards, but she said, no way, these are terrible. They're going to be dumbing down students. I'm not going to put my signature on this.
And Alex, let me interrupt you just a moment there, because we've got to take a quick break, and we're going to be right back with you after the break.
Email your questions and comments about today's program to onair@jsm.org. We're tackling issues affecting the modern church. If you have a suggestion for a future program, send it to onair@jsm.org.
Okay, we'll be back, ladies and gentlemen. And let me say this to all of you that are writing in. If you'd like to send me an email, onair@jsm.org, and you have a question that you'd like to ask our guest, now he will be staying with us on the second half of the program to take your questions and answer your questions for. But in the meantime, if you would like me to ask him a question, send me an email, onair@jsm.org, and I will get it on the air for you and get it answered. And Alex, along with what you're saying, I've read so much material on this that I'm trying to digest all of it about what you're saying. But I want to ask this question. Another article that I was reading concerning Common Core, it made this statement, and it said that the Tennessee Liberty Alliance co-founder, Glenn Jacobs, and he is one of the critics of Common Core, that he suggested that the Common Core proponents were seeking to produce, through our children, what Russian communists referred to as the new Soviet man. Do you agree with that?
It might sound kind of out there and fantastical, but he's actually, unfortunately, exactly right. And even some of these quack Soviet psychologists and behaviorists and educators who were actually trying to develop the new Soviet man, a lot of their philosophies and pedagogical strategies have been imported into this country. Vygotsky is a good example. He was a Soviet quack who came up with all these theories about how to, quote unquote, educate children, kind of treat them like animals and, use behavioral psychology to mold their minds and mold their behavior, hammer the individualism out of them, and kind of shape their minds to be good collectivists. These are pedagogical strategies that are taught in teaching colleges all across this country, all across Western Europe. And this is a global phenomenon. We've had 100 years of these kinds of bizarre experiments in terms of, trying to shape and mold children into something that, is completely alien to Western civilization, especially to Christians. But unfortunately, that's the reality. It's going on every day in schools all across this country and in schools all around the world. And, quite frankly, it's not an exaggeration.
And it's not, and teachers don't even realize what they're teaching. Some people, Christians that love the Lord, they don't really realize what they're teaching in the public school system. My concern is that two bills that are in the Congress and the Senate, that is H.R. 5 is one of them, and I forget the number of the other one. Jim, do you have it? H.R.
3715.
H.R. 3715, you know, is speedily moving through to be voted on. And my concern is if this bill is voted on and passed in the House and in the Senate, it will affect Christian schools, private schools, homeschooling, moms and dads, because it will be a law then.
Yeah, you know, the Christians and the homeschools and the private schools are directly in the crosshairs of the education establishment. And, you know, they're using a number of strategies to try to make Common Core inescapable. I'll give you, you know, one example. The guy who's in charge of the College Board now, which produces the SATs that, you know, virtually everybody who wants to get into university has to use, or the ACT, which is already aligned to Common Core. But the new head of the College Board, David Coleman, he's widely described as the architect of Common Core. And he's already promised that the SAT is going to be aligned to the Common Core. And all the major textbook publishing houses are aligning their materials to the Common Core. Even in the states that refused to adopt Common Core initially, Texas, Alaska, Virginia, and you know, some others took a few pieces and left a few pieces out. Even there, Common Core is coming in through the back door. They're using, you know, different names. But they're still using all the same textbooks, all the same materials. And even in states that have banned Common Core, like Oklahoma, I wrote an article about a month ago. Oklahoma banned Common Core. They passed a law. The governor signed it. No more Common Core. Common Core is banned in this state. And yet it's still in the schools. They're still implementing it. They're still forcing teachers to teach. And this teacher, she had been in the classroom for 22 years. She had won, you know, awards, great teacher, always positive feedback. She said, I can't do it anymore. I'm not going to do it anymore. And so she had to resign, unfortunately. And, you know, so many of the good teachers, there is a lot of good teachers in the schools who have no idea what's going on. And they're being driven out by this kind of nonsense. And one of the points that we make in the book is that, you know, by and large, teachers are just as much victims of this as students. They go to the education colleges and they're taught that this is the scientific way to teach children. And, you know, it's just quackery disguised as science. But, you know, the effects on the children are unspeakable. I mean, the miseducation that our children are receiving now is going to have implications, you know, so far beyond what people can imagine. This isn't just an issue to consider in isolation. If we're producing millions of illiterates, you know, how are we going to sustain our civilization? How are we going to sustain our liberty and the faith? And, you know, where is this all going to go when we have these pliable children who, you know, have been just literally indoctrinated, who have been dumbed down, who are unable to read properly and therefore are unable to acquire knowledge and information independent of the education establishment and the mass media and so on. And so the implications of this are humongous.
Well, they'll be workers for the government. They'll do the government jobs, whatever mundane job that is. It's actually a Soviet system or a Marxist system.
You're right on the money right there.
Yeah.
And this data gathering, you mentioned the psychological testing going on. The data gathering under Common Core. So, you know, there's elements that are separate from Common Core but related, and then there's elements that are direct components of Common Core. They're building dossiers at the federal level, at the Department of Education, on every child that's going through the government schools, and even some that are going through the private schools, and some that are homeschooled in states where they're constantly doing testing and checkups and these kinds of things. And I mean, Arne Duncan, the education secretary, has been so explicit about what they're doing. It's, you know, he doesn't use the term central planning, but he's talking about we're going to train these children for the green jobs that they're going to get when they're older. And, you know, a lot of education systems already use this model where the child turns 13 or 14 and they look at his past performance, his psychological profile, and they say, hey, you're going to be suitable to be a plumber. You're going to be suitable to be a janitor. You're going to be suitable to be a politician. And then they put them on different tracks.
Right.
Now, you know, that does not respect the will of the child. That does not respect the will of the parents. And that does not respect the will of God. And so this is just, you know, monstrous, in my opinion. You can't make decisions for children about what they're going to do with their lives. That is essentially Marxism, communism, National Socialism, whatever you want to call it. It certainly isn't liberty, and it certainly has nothing to do with the foundations of our country.
No, but you know, did you want to ask something, Jim?
The goal of the whole thing with this new world order and this one world government is to dumb people that are dumbed down are easier to control, and so that's what the whole school system is about, is to stop them, as we've already said, from thinking for themselves and following somebody that's going to lead them down a path of slavery is what it's really about. But again, people that are on drugs, you mentioned that with the people that are on drugs, children that are on drugs and are uneducated, ignorant, so to speak, they're easier to control, and that's where it's all going.
You're absolutely right, and that's exactly what's happening. And if you can read through their kind of code words, like sustainability is a big buzzword nowadays in the education establishment and everywhere else. I'm sure they got some kind of marketing team, and they came up with a word that would sound acceptable to the public. And they use the word green a lot too. I call the green the watermelon.
Green.
Yeah, they're green on the outside and they're red on the inside. Because if you look at the things that they're promoting, it's practically Marxism. They just use it, under the cover of environmentalism. So we need to reduce the population for the good of the environment. We need to centrally plan the economy for the good of the environment. We need to control everything about education for the good of the environment. And so everything is being justified with, high-sounding, nice ideas. But if you just scratch right beneath the surface, it becomes so clear what they're doing. And you're absolutely right. They're moving us toward a global society, a global government, a global system. And for the purposes of that, they want children who are unable to think critically.
Right. Yes.
Now,
That's right.
Yes.
They can't think for themselves.
Right.
They have to have some. All right.
And
you
even
mentioned
the churches are getting into this. The churches are even getting involved in this.
Exactly. We discussed that yesterday, Jim. You're exact, and I was going to bring that up later. But you mentioned the financing that's behind this Common Core, and you mentioned Bill Gates, which he is the #1 proponent. But there's also other money involved in it, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the same group of people that's behind everything that's not good for America. That's what I'm going to...
That's exactly right. Yeah. And Congress did an investigation into these foundations, and they tried to quash it afterwards. But the Reese Committee was put together to look at what these gigantic tax-exempt foundations were doing. And, I challenge anybody to look into this and think that these people are working for the good of humanity.
No,
they
not.
were very frank about what they were doing. The chief investigator, Norman Dodd, said that he was told by the head of the Carnegie Foundation that they're moving us toward merging the United States with the Soviet system on the road to a global government. And they're using the grants for Common Core and for all kinds of other things all across, the societal spectrum to move us in that direction. The report is out there. It can be acquired. The knowledge is public. Anybody can read it. The problem is that the media doesn't want to talk about it. Right. And, the pastors have not really been educating their flocks. I mean, certainly some have, but we all have a responsibility here to speak the truth. And if we don't, the world is going to fall into darkness. We have a responsibility to be the light, to bring the light here, and shine the light on the darkness. And that's what we really need to be doing, because the minds of our children are at stake. Our country is at stake. Our liberty is at stake. And we need to get busy here.
Well, Alex, you mentioned the churches and the pastors. A lot of them's hands are tied because they're taking government money for programs in their church. And, for these feeding programs, helping communities and so forth and so on. So the federal government is giving them money. So therefore, they have to go along with what the federal government is saying. They cannot be an independent church and speak the mind and speak from the Word of God and teach and preach what the Word of God says. They have got, because of that money, and that's kind of where the states are. Because when we were looking into this a mental health screening that we were talking about, the more kids that's diagnosed with mental health problems in the schools, the more money that school will get. And
that's
so,
exactly right.
So it's, everybody is, you mentioned the green movement. And let's go, and it fits right in with when you tie all of this together, it all fits right in together. Our educational program, Common Core, Agenda 21, sustainability, the green movement, everything that is negative and bad for this country, they're all intertwined together to support and to the myth and the idea like climate change. What is it? There hasn't been any really sign of warming in I forget how many years. Listen,
like 2 decades.
Yeah, but yet, this we got to do, and the federal government is pushing it right on. It doesn't matter what the scientists say. And, of course, a lot of people stand to make a lot of money out of the so-called climate change or whatever they change the name to. It changes almost daily. But I was listening just this week over the news, and they were talking about a survey had come out concerning the educational level of the different countries of the world. And I was literally shocked when they said that the United States of America, we were either, I may be off, but it was like 37, 38, 8th in the line of nations. And I'm thinking, there's that many nations that are ahead of us in the education of our children. Well, if that's the case, then these other nations are not buying into this Common Core. So where is that going to leave America?
Well, I think Americans are especially a target of these people who want to build, what Arne Duncan calls the green world order. I've been following the United Nations around at these conferences for many years as a journalist. I went to their sustainability summit, the Rio Plus 20 in Rio de Janeiro. Uh-huh. And, it was astounding to see posters with a sick earth, with the thermometer coming out of its mouth. And then the doctor comes up and he says, I know what you have. You have humans, as if humans are the disease here. And, it's essentially repealing Genesis, right? In Genesis, God told us to be fruitful, to multiply, to subdue the earth, and so on. What the green movement wants is precisely the opposite. Don't be fruitful, don't multiply, don't have children. Everything's got to be green. We've all got to live in compact little cities. And this is going on all around the globe. So when I see the rankings of, the United States falling further and further behind, it's true. And part of the reason is because the United States has some very crucial advantages when it comes to opposing this. We have, hundreds of years of tradition of liberty, of Christianity being, the dominant force in our society. We have the Constitution that protects our rights. We have the Declaration of Independence that explains our rights come from God and that government exists to protect those rights. So the United States has a special place here. It's a giant obstacle to people who would want to, build a green world order with no freedom and, that sort of thing. So the United States needs to be especially targeted for the dumbing down and, all these other things. Now, when it comes to these international tests, I think the international tests themselves are in many ways skewed. So I don't know that they're always a good barometer, but there's no question that the U.S. education system is becoming much, much worse. Many other countries have better educational systems, although they're all kind of moving toward this harmonized system that the UNESCO has been promoting for generations. And, ultimately, and the governments have come together and told us this. They came together first in 1990. They came up with a declaration where they had, there was supposed to be this core of knowledge that all humans require, and the UN is going to define what knowledge we all require. This is pornographic sex education that's coming into our schools that the UNESCO is promoting, promoting abortion, promoting the sustainability. So the UN also has the Sustainable Education for All initiative. And so eventually the global education system is going to be very similar from country to country. There might be a few minor differences. In the US, they'll teach it in English, and in Finland, they'll teach it in Finnish. But ultimately, we're moving toward a convergence. And it's becoming very evident when you look at the educational reforms that are happening in every country that the UNESCO is promoting. They just put out a report last week bragging about how much progress they had made in harmonizing the global education system. They said, when we started this in 1990, there was only 3 or 4 countries that had national curriculum and national tests. Today, there's more than 100. So what good progress we're making. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because that's what's happening with Common Core. But ultimately, they do want to impose this, nightmarish miseducation system on the entire planet.
Yeah, and this is just so that it can fit right into let me read this statement here. It says it better than the way I'm fixing to say it. But it says that control is actually the real goal of Common Core, to be able to control the citizens. And then I read a statement where that Nelson Mandela has said that the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world is education, educating our kids. And so what we've got about 3 generations now that's been educated in these liberal schools, and that we're turning out students, they don't even know what the history of the United States is. and they can't read, they can't write. And so they're getting the type of citizen that the government can control. But here's what another statement that was made. It said the goal is not education through Common Core. The goal of Common Core is not education, but the product of a compliant, dependent, uneducated citizen. And that is needed to implement the Agenda 21 with the help of UNESCO, Education for All programs. And so, Bill Gates, as you mentioned, his money, he's given, what did you say, $2 billion to this project, and we'll be giving more, but we'll be giving more. He is a proponent of the UN and all of the citizens being world citizens, which means that the whole world is controlled by this small group of men and women, and all of us become just little robots.
That's their plan, no doubt about it. And, you mentioned Common Core not being for education. That's really clear. I mentioned earlier they had put two subject matter experts on this rubber stamp validation committee. I talked about the first one, Dr. Sandra Stotsky, who refused to sign off because she said, hey, this is going to reduce the critical thinking abilities of children and, all these other complaints. Then the math expert, Dr. James Milgram at Stanford, also not opposed to national standards per se, he also refused to sign off. He said, the math methodologies here don't work. Some of them are experimental. Some of them we know don't work. And on top of that, some of these standards are based on incorrect math. So how can it be that the only two subject matter experts on the committee refused to sign off, one of them saying that this is incorrect material, and now this is going to be rolled out in our schools all across the country? Clearly, this is not to improve education. That much should be patently obvious to anybody who has even looked at this for the briefest moment. But the real agenda is exactly what you're saying, moving us toward this world system where you have Bill Gates refusing to send his son or his child to a Common Core school, I think is very telling. He put $2 billion of his own money into this, yet he sends his son to a elite private school where they don't use Common Core. Same thing with the Obama family. They have bribed all the states to impose Common Core on our people, and they send their daughters to a private school that refuses to use Common Core and that doesn't use these Common Core tests. So what's going on? The two chief cheerleaders for this system, for us, don't participate in it themselves. That should be a dead giveaway that something is very, very fishy here.
All right. The Department of Education was created by Congress under President Jimmy Carter in 1979. And it's been growing in power ever since then. Would we be fair to say we need to do away with the Department of Education?
No question about it. I mean, this is one of the chief sources of all of this lunacy. And we can see it in the objective data. We can look at the test scores since the Department of Education was created. The SATs are plummeting. They even have to recenter it every 10 years or so to conceal the dumbing down of our population. So all of the objective data is clear. Even when the government does a study, it's clear that education is declining. We're spending ever more billions of dollars on it. It just keeps getting worse. And the Department of Education has been crucial in all of this. Now, some people think, hey, that sounds radical to abolish a government department. Can we really do that? Well, first of all, it hasn't been around for that long. Second of all, this was the mainstream Republican position during the Reagan administration. Ronald Reagan campaigned on abolishing the Department of Education. He didn't succeed, but 49 out of 50 states or something went for Ronald Reagan. So this is a popular view, and clearly the education department didn't do what it was marketed as. It was supposed to improve education, and we've gotten exactly the opposite. We've spent billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars on this lunacy, and what do we have to show for it? We have 55% of American adults who are functionally illiterate. Now, if this is not craziness, I don't know what is.
Exactly. What can we do, Alex? I've got thousands of people that are listening to this program, and they're upset. Many of them are aware of what we're discussing today. The question they always send me is, what can we do to help? I always tell them, I want to see if you agree with me. Maybe you can add more to it. But I always tell them to educate the people in what's going on. Programs just like this. getting in their little inner circles and bringing these type of conversations to the forefront and discussing them and so forth and so on. What would you add to that?
You're so right, Francis. And that is really going to be key, is making the public aware of what is going on here. On a personal level, I think parents at this point have an obligation, a duty to get their children out of the government schools. And I don't say that to be mean. And I know it's, hardship on some parents. They have, the way the economy has been set up at this point now, often you have families where both parents have to work just to get by. But where there's a will, there's a way. And, we have a responsibility from God and to our children to get them out of this system. They're undermining the faith. They're teaching total lunacy. They're teaching them evolution and that their life is, worth nothing more than a goldfish. And there is no truth. There is no reality. We can come up with our own morality. So, this is just wickedness. God told us, parents have the responsibility for their children, raise them up in the faith, and they won't depart from it. We're the way it stands now, a lot of parents are surrendering their children to Caesar. Show me where in the Bible it says that we need to give our children to Caesar to be educated. That's
exactly
in the Bible.
That's exactly right. We've quickly got to go to a break, but we're talking about this, educating the people to where they understand, which I believe that's extremely important. Talking about it, making people aware of what's going on. Are you finding, Alex, I'll ask you one quick question, then we're going to break. Are you finding that people are really not interested in it, or are you finding out that they are interested in it, they just did not know it was happening in the schools?
I think the one, maybe if we can say a positive thing that came out of Common Core is across the country, parents are now taking a look at the schools. And before, it was just assumed that, hey, this is just, a big national accident that we ended up with this educational fiasco. With Common Core, parents are taking a closer look. And this is really, really good news, because just looking at what's going on, parents are going to wake up. And that is, for me, extremely encouraging.
Yes. All right, we got to take a quick break. We're going to be back with Alex Newman right after the break, and we will be taking your questions. And the number to call is 800-342-8430. Now, if you're listening in the United Kingdom, that number is 0800-068-8162. And these numbers will be flashed on the screen. And if you have a question or something you don't understand about what we're discussing today, or you need more information concerning Common Core, now is the time to call.
The Francis and Friends program is made possible by your financial support. Thank you, and God bless. Join Francis and Friends on Facebook, facebook.com/Francis Swigert.
Okay, we're back with our special guest today, who is Alex Newman. And Alex is an educator and an international journalist. And he writes for numerous publications in the United States and abroad. He teaches advanced economics to high school students through Freedom Project Educational. Now, he has co-authored the book, which is just released, I think, this week, Crimes of the Educators, which I'm encouraging all of you that are listening to get your hands on that book. Read it. You need to know what it says. And Alex is joining us today from Miami, Florida. And Alex, before I go to our first caller today, who is Helen from California, let me read a couple of emails that have come in during the break. The first question is, many people are asking, how can I know if my child is being taught the Common Core curriculum? Would I be safe in saying if they're in a public school system, that is the curriculum that is being used?
Absolutely. Initially about 45 states and the District of Columbia agreed to impose Common Core. But even in the states that rejected it, and even in the states that have since tried to back out, Common Core is still there. And if you look at, the textbooks that they're using, you'll probably see on the front, at least if they've purchased them in the last few years, you'll see on the front aligned with national standards or Common Core compliant, things like this. If they're in a government school, you can be almost sure that they're learning from the Common Core. Now, in some places, it's still being rolled out and they're still transitioning, but they expect it to be firmly in place by the end of this year, next year at the latest.
Yesterday on the program, as you know, Tennessee has been having some struggles trying to get rid of Common Core in its school systems. At least that's what we've been hearing over the news. And they are now saying that they have voted it out of the state of Tennessee, and none of the schools in Tennessee is using it. But I became alarmed when I read that they said they had changed the name of the curriculum. And
this is happening everywhere, Francis.
And that this and that, and I've read that too much. I mean, where that they just changed the name of it, but it's still the same old system that was already in place. And I was consoling and talking with some of the people from Tennessee. Don't be too sure that has been voted out of your state. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely, Francis. I actually wrote about Tennessee yesterday, but this is just the same thing we've seen over and over again. If you read the text of the legislation, it doesn't repeal Common Core. What it does is it orders a commission to be created to review Common Core. And so Common Core is going to be there no matter what until 2017, 2018. And then after that, they're supposed to come up with new college and career ready standards. They use a synonym, but exactly the same terminology. And so what I suspect is going to happen, and not every lawmaker who voted for this was trying to be deceptive. They heard the constituents' outcry and they said, well, we got to do something. Unfortunately, this bill is not going to cut it. It's the same thing that we just saw in Indiana. Indiana made a big fuss about, hey, we repealed Common Core. They copied and pasted 90% of the standards, slapped the new name on them, Indiana standards, and we're right back at square one. And this is happening everywhere. It's a deliberate strategy to mislead parents and taxpayers because the lawmakers know the public is beyond outraged about this. Even the teachers and the teachers' unions in some cases are saying this has got to go, but they don't want to get rid of it because then the federal funding dries up and the Bill Gates money dries up and all these other little incentives that they've put in. So they're being, unfortunate to say, in a lot of cases, they're being deceptive when they say they're getting rid of Common Core.
What do you know, Alex, about the state of Louisiana? Because our governor has been very vocal in opposition to this. But exactly where is Louisiana today?
I did write about Louisiana a number of months ago, and it was really encouraging to see Governor Jindal come out and say, you know what, enough of this. After, originally having supported it, I think he saw the light and said, oh, my goodness, what is going on here? Unfortunately, the last time I was updated on this, the state educational bureaucracy said, you know what, we don't care what the governor says. We're going to just keep doing this anyway. And that's the last I've heard about it. I hope there's been more progress.
Well, the business community here is promoting it very, very strongly, and they're trying to keep it in the school systems, which surprises me. But yet, I guess it doesn't surprise me. Let me go on with another question. It said, I went to my oldest daughter's college orientation, and I was told I could not access her grades without her permission. I was stunned. And I voiced that I wouldn't pay for it if I could. I wasn't going to pay for her college if I could not access her grades. Does this have anything to do with Common Core?
At the university level, I don't know. I know that the Obama administration has an agenda for the education reform at the universities. They're basically trying to federalize the universities as well. But this is part of a much broader and very troubling trend in that parents are being shut out of their child's education. Not only did we lose all control of our schools, through the school board and through elections and even through our state legislatures, now, you have school officials calling themselves co-parents. The schools are not a co-parent with me over my children. I'm sorry, that's total lunacy. And but that's the direction we're moving. You had the MSNBC host, Melissa Harris Perry, say that, we need to have a new thinking and children belong to the community. And that's where they're going with this. If parents don't get active and say, wait a minute, I have parental rights. God gave me the responsibility to raise my children. And, if I decide to get you involved, you need to, keep your distance and not pretend like you're a co-parent with me.
Right. And listen, I forgot to, but I want to welcome Brother Dave Smith to the panel. He was just able to come in, and Dave himself is an educator as well as a minister of the gospel. And you want to say something, Dave?
Glad to be here, but I think on the college level, usually students are legally adults, and therefore there are restrictions to who has access. But I would think any student could sign some kind of a release for their parent to have access to the grades. That shouldn't be a problem.
I would think you're right about that. Okay, another question, Alex, before we go to our callers. Please give us some ideas of solution. Please tell us how we can fight against it. If Oklahoma made it against the law, but it is still being forced into schools, how can we solve this issue? It is frustrating to learn about these horrendous systems with no idea of solutions.
Great question. And I think the first thing that needs to be done, parents, get your kids out of the government schools. But, we cannot surrender America's children to this kind of lunacy. And so we have a responsibility also to worry about, the rest of society. And so we need to, first of all, identify the problem. We have a big hurdle in this country in that people, they can't believe that this would all be deliberate, that our children are being deliberately dumbed down. We have all the proof, all the evidence of that in the bibliography for our book. We quote primary sources because we wanted to explain to people this is not an accident. So first, we need to educate ourselves on the problem. Then we need to educate others about the problem. And then we need to get organized and active. We need to take over the school boards. We need to, if our state legislators won't listen, we need to replace them. In Congress, we need them to shut down the Department of Education and stop the bribe money from the Department of Education to our states to control everything that's going on in our schools. And finally, we need to just get rid of UNESCO. We withdrew from UNESCO before. Ronald Reagan said, no way, we're not participating in this anti-American.
And now we're back in it.
Exactly. Now we're back in it. And this is a dictator's club. I mean, most of the members of the United Nations are third world autocrats, communists, and Islamists. And what business do they have dictating education policy in the United States? So we need to get back to the basics. We need to teach phonics in the schools. Our schools need to be controlled at the local level. And in the meantime, we just need to get the kids out of the government schools.
All right. This email, Alex, comes from the country of England. And he's got a couple of statements in here that I probably don't agree with, and I don't think it's truthful, but maybe you have information on it that I don't. So I'm going to go ahead and read it. It said, thank you for exposing the demon spirits that pervade this world, especially the demonic system that is called socialism. I had never thought about that, but that is a good description of it. Your program consistently gives us moral guidance and good old-fashioned common sense. Common Core is a communist plot to introduce communism into the United States by the back door, and it must be challenged. Now, I've heard that Vladimir Putin himself personally put millions of dollars that he diverted from the Bolshevik ballet directly into Common Core. I've not heard that. Do you have any information on that, Alex?
I don't know anything about Putin, but I think if people would read the Communist Manifesto, they would be shocked and appalled to see how far in that direction we have already drifted. I mean, look at the things. Karl Marx had 10 planks in the Communist Manifesto for how we're going to go toward communism. Government control of all the schools was one of the key ones. Progressive income tax was another one. A strong central bank with a monopoly on currency and credit. So, people need to realize that communism didn't really die when the Soviet Union died. For goodness sakes, the biggest country in the world is run by the Communist Party, Communist China. It's a communist dictatorship, and they've given some appearances of, allowing the market system to work, but it is still communism. All the big companies there are owned by the regime or by the communist military, and communism never went anywhere. It's still alive and well. The criminals were never punished after the fall of the Soviet Union. That should tell you something there. Yeah. After Nazi Germany, after the National Socialists were crushed, they were punished, and quite rightly so. But when the Soviet Union fell, I mean, these people murdered 100 million people, and they're walking around free. Some of them are in legislatures in the European Union and commissioners. And, how can this possibly be? So communism never died. And there's a reason people call Common Core Commie Core. It's... And I was saying earlier about the green is the new red. It's kind of funny, but I don't mean it just at a joking level. It's dead serious under the guise of green. So, they know that red is no longer popular. Communism has gotten a pretty bad name, rightfully so. So now they switch strategies. Now it's all to benefit the environment. Mm-hmm.
It's all green, but as you said earlier, it's red on the inside. Yep. Exactly that's a good statement. All right, let's go to our first caller, who is Helen in California. Helen, welcome to Sunlight Broadcasting, and you have a quick question.
Well, thank you for having me on the show. And basically, I wanted to thank you for making the public aware of Common Core, because so many people, so many news channels out there are not talking about this. So I just clearly first want to thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you. We feel like it touches the heart of Christianity, and it stands to prevent us from the freedom of speech. All of this is working together, Helen, and it has large ramifications. And if somebody doesn't speak out and make the public aware of it, this thing is going to overtake our nation, and we will wake up one day and we no longer have our freedoms to teach, to preach the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's why that I have been so vocal about this, and others on this network. But did you have a question, Helen?
Well, I just wanted to say basically that out here in California, we have been fighting this for about a year now, a little over a year, and that there are things that people can do. Right now in California, we are encouraging people to opt out. A lot of people don't know that's their right. They can take their child out of the testing because a lot of the curriculum is tied to the testing. And without the testing, these big organizations, corporations do not make their money that they are trying to make off our children. And they are also trying to get all that data to go to the federal government, and then it goes into a big cloud for other entities to tap into your child's information. So it's vital for people to opt their children out and also look into other ways of educating their children. There's Freedom Project at Duke Pesta out of Wisconsin. Professor Duke Pesta is of making that available for online schooling. And there's alternative schools, classical education, where children can go part-time and then part-time at home. But one point I really want to make is about that's been troublesome is the private Christian schools. Christian schools need to take a stand against Common Core because it has been penetrating in those as well. And we as Christians need to take a stand against it and don't take any curriculum or anything from the government because that just ties you to them. So we, as Christians, we need to be firm in our beliefs and stand up against this awful, evil overreach of our government. It's just so big. It's just hard to even imagine what has happened with our education.
Right. Well, Helen, you're right. And I mentioned this a while ago, that if a church is taking government money in any form for its school, then it's going to have to teach the curriculum and say what the government tells it to say. Now, we have an academy here where we take them from 6 weeks old through the 12th grade, but we do not take any government money. It's funded by our church here, Family Worship Center. So I am very much aware of what you're saying, Helen. And thank you for calling. Go ahead, Dave.
It's very difficult even now to get textbooks that are not impacted by Common Core. All of the major publishers are ingrained with this. Also, some of the Christian-oriented curriculums are also going to Common Core.
Yes.
And it's becoming more and more difficult. Another area is testing that she mentioned. The SAT and the ACT are eventually going to be realigned, and it will be difficult for private school students, homeschool students, to be able to get into a college without having some leaning toward and passing those tests. So eventually that's going to be an area where the control is going to be even greater.
You're right, 100%, Dave. Alex, would you like to make a comment on Helen's call?
Yeah, Helen was right on the money. And, that's one thing I didn't mention, opting out of the test. If you need to keep your kids in the government school, again, I say get them out, homeschool, use, she talked about Freedom Project Education. I teach there. It's a wonderful resource, and there's others like it out there. Parents, you can make it work. But if your kids are in the government schools and for some reason you can't possibly get them out, definitely opt out of these tests. These tests are, she touched on some of the problems that the data gathering that is going on for these tests is huge. And, they're also the enforcement tool. When Bill Gates was talking to the National Conference of State Legislatures in 2009, he said, hey, these tests are going to be crucial to getting schools all over the country teaching Common Core. If nobody's taking the tests, it's going to be a lot harder to, first of all, enforce Common Core compliance, and second of all, to force all these teachers to teach it. How is the federal government even going to know if it's working? So absolutely, I encourage people to opt out of these tests.
Exactly. And it's going to be difficult, and it's getting increasingly more difficult because, as Dave Smith just said, to find textbooks, we have to go back many years to get history books that actually teach the history of the United States of America. But I'm reading now that they're fixing to stop the publication, to where it's going to be much more difficult for Christian schools, private schools, homeschooling moms and dads, and to get literature, to get books, to be able to teach their children the reading, writing, and arithmetic. In fact, it's even today very, very difficult because some of the publishers where we used to buy our textbooks from, they're no longer there. We're having to search to try to find something. So I know exactly what you're saying. Let's go to Gene in Nebraska. Gene, welcome to Sunlight Broadcasting.
Well, good morning, everybody.
Hey, this is another former school teacher.
You bet. You bet.
Yeah.
I have an acronym for AGENDA.
Oh, okay.
Anti-Christian, godless evil now dominates America.
Well, you're probably right there. I don't disagree with that at all.
Okay. Are you familiar with a book titled The Giver by Lois Lowry?
Yes, I just got my hands on that and started reading it last week. Alex, I know you're familiar with that. Mm-hmm. Hello, Alex?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
If it's the one I'm thinking about, I had to read that in middle school, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that is required reading in middle school. And basically what it does, it describes a perfect utopian society in which the physical, mental, and emotional facets of the human being are totally and completely controlled. And I read it about 6 months ago, and it still haunts me. It's awful.
Right. And they had to have this one man that he's called the giver, and he's the one that provides and takes care of all the community. Is that right? And
That's it.
And then whenever he passes away, he picks one of the, or it gets time for him to pass away, he picks one of the younger men in that community, that little community that he controls, and trains him on how to be the giver. However, one of them decides he likes what he sees on the outside after he gets out. And so, but I hadn't read all the book, Gene, so I'm saying things that I really don't, I haven't read all the book. But I've had other former teachers that have called in or sent me emails and asked me to read that book.
Yes, it's awful.
Yeah.
I just have not words to describe it.
Oh, okay.
You all be blessed, and thank you for taking my call.
Sure, Gene, always good to talk with you. And the question is, and Alex, I hope you can answer this because I certainly can't, but they're asking the question, what is the difference between the Iowa test and the Common Core testing of today?
I'm not familiar with the Iowa test in particular, but what I do know about the current test, there's two national Common Core aligned tests, both of them funded by the federal government. There's the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, and then the PARC, which is the partnership assessment something. And so both of these tests are funded by the federal government. Both of them are aligned to Common Core, and they're being rolled out across the country. Now, we've had, I think, about 9 or 10 states back out of it so far, and that's encouraging. But they're developing their own, state test that's also aligned to Common Core. So it's not necessarily a huge improvement, but the testing issue is huge. It's one of the key ways that they're using to gather data on the children, and it's also one of the key enforcement mechanisms for Common Core to make sure all the teachers are sticking to the script. And so for those reasons, I think this is extremely troubling. And again, it didn't start with Common Core. The No Child Left Behind first came up with this idea that the states need federal funding, and in exchange for the federal funding, they need to impose tests based on these standards. But it's very troubling nonetheless.
Okay, another question while we're waiting. Do you know any the specifics about the state of Nevada using Common Core. The website for Nevada Education says specifically that they do not teach Common Core in the schools. But as you have mentioned, they may be calling it by another name. Do you have any information, Alex, on the state of Nevada?
Nevada is not one of the states that I've looked closely at, but I know it wasn't on the list of the original states who refused Common Core, and I haven't heard about them withdrawing from it. So if anything, I wonder if the education bureaucracy didn't just rename it Nevada Standards and change 2 words here and there and say, suddenly these are new standards. That would be my guess, but I don't know.
Could be. All right, we got to take another quick break, and we're going to be right back with Alex Newman in just a moment.
Truth. Sometimes it's hard to find. That's why there's Francis and Friends. Previous Francis and Friends programs are available online at sunlifetv.com.
Okay, we're back, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm going to Darlene from New Hampshire. Darlene, are you there?
I am.
Oh, great. And do you have a question?
Morning.
Good morning.
I do. Good morning to everybody on the panel and to Alex.
Good morning.
My question is about the 2 bills that you were talking about earlier, the H.R. 5, and I'm not sure about the number of the other bill.
It's H.R., where is it, Jim? I just wrote it down.
371.
It's H.R. 3715.
Right. So what happens, I understood that if those 2 bills go through, that the Christian school, the homeschoolers, and then private schools will all fall under the Common Core education. But what happens if the bills do not go through and the traditional education that you're trying to teach the children or the high school students now, what happens to them, especially when they are going from the elementary into the middle school, then they get out of high school and they're trying to go into college? Will they be refused because they don't fall under the government guidelines of proper education for what the government is requiring of these students? And also, if our president and many of these other people that have their children going to private schools, if they're not required, or their schools are not required, I should say, to have the education of the Common Core, what happens to them when they go to college? Are they going to be refused, or will they be allowed to go to these schools? Because they'll have to take some kind of testing to get into those schools.
Right. All right, Alex, I'm going to let you answer that.
Okay, excellent question. And one of the things that's really interesting about, say, homeschoolers, for example, is that universities now are actively seeking them out. They know that homeschoolers are light years ahead of their government school peers, and they're trying to bring them into the universities. Whether that would change when they realign the SAT and the ACT to be fully compliant with Common Core, it's hard to say. But as far as people like Bill Gates' children, who are going to private schools where there's no Common Core, they're not going to have any problem getting into university. I mean, Bill Gates could write a check for $10 million. That would be like one of us dropping a dime out of our pocket, and any school would accept him. So they're not going to have any issue with that at all. And what they're doing kind of with this education system is they're almost creating 2 separate classes. They have the masses, the dumbed down, the ones who can't read, the ones who can't do math, the ones who don't know any history, any science, anything. And then you have the elite, upper classes that are supposed to kind of run this whole system. Now, I was very fortunate in that I went to some of the best private schools literally in the world, and I was blessed in that sense. But, so there's a lot of schools like this that are kind of training up the generation that's supposed to kind of run this machinery of all of this. But for the masses, they get the dumbed down education, the Common Core, the look-say method to learn how to not read, the inaccurate math. And so there's a very clear division forming here between the masses and the elites, the establishment, whatever you want to call them.
Okay, Darlene, did that answer your question?
It does, but what happens is that if the bills go through, then every educational system will be under the same system.
That's right.
So how do you get from not wanting it? I know that it's really a lot of PR, public relations, and getting out there and voicing what you know. But living here, I see it all the time. My own grandchildren are under that curriculum.
Well, that's why you have to just, like we're doing today, Darlene, keep pushing. Just try to prevent these bills from getting through. Alex, I'm going to let you respond.
Yeah, one of the things that they're trying to do, and I wrote about a piece of legislation they were considering in Congress not long ago. I don't remember the bill number offhand. It might be one of the ones that you're referring to, but they wanted to reauthorize the ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and they wanted to reauthorize No Child Left Behind. And then somebody snuck a provision in there to allow federal funds to be used to take to private schools, charter schools, Christian schools, etc. Now, I know there's a lot of well-meaning people who like that idea. You know, let's get out of the government schools. How can we do that? Well, we'll use a voucher system, or we'll use tax money to finance private schools, whatever. I warn people about this. I think it could be very dangerous. You know, my dad always used to tell me that with federal aid comes federal control. And he meant, you know, I pay for your bills because you're a kid, and that means I get to tell you what to do. But the principle is right on the money. Once the tax money starts funding the private schools, the Christian schools, then the politicians will say, you know what, we need to regulate these schools. We need to tell them what curriculums to use. We need to tell them how to teach. And I think that's a very big danger. And I say it from firsthand experience. I spent about 5 years living in Sweden, and there they had this idea. The government schools aren't working out that great. Let's finance the private schools with tax money. And, it wasn't a moment later they said, all right, well, now that we're financing the private schools with tax money, they have to teach the national curriculum that teaches them that gender is a social construct and homosexuality is good and great. And they even banned homeschooling in 2010. So, I think it's well-intentioned on the part of a lot of people. And, there's even some good Republicans in Congress that think this is going to solve the issue. I don't think it will. I think it represents a big threat. Now, will Bill Gates' kids and Obama's kids ever be learning from the Common Core? No. No matter what kind of bill they pass in Congress that mandates such and such, these people have billions of dollars. They are the establishment. They make the rules. They don't have to obey the rules. And I can assure everybody that their kids are never going to be using the Common Core. As for the rest of us, I think it's a very real threat that we need to worry about. Right now, they're using primarily the soft approach, the backdoor approach, align all the tests, make the homeschoolers take the test, et cetera, get all the publishing houses aligned with it all. But I would not be surprised at all if they try a firmer approach going forward if they don't meet with success with the way that they're doing right now.
That's exactly right. We've been through that here in the state of Louisiana. All right, let's go to Angela in Indiana. Angela, welcome to Sun Life Broadcasting. You have a question?
Yes, I do. Good morning.
Good morning.
I thank God for the wisdom this morning. And I have two parts. My first question is that my daughter attends a Common Core school, and it's, we can't help her like with her math homework. She has trouble. So I asked the school to send me a book home. They won't send me a book home, so I found it kind of hard to help her with her math homework.
Well, and you need to turn your television down, Angela.
Hold on one second.
Yeah. And that's one of the, I think the big arguments is, I know that's how Governor Jindal, he went to help his children with their math, and he saw what his children were being taught, and that's what turned him so much against the Common Core curriculum. But did you want to answer that, Alex?
Yeah, and I think this is part of the broader agenda we were talking about before. It's building a divide, a chasm between parents and their kids. Now, aside from the fact that this math is partly based on incorrect math and the new math they're calling it now, the pedagogy and the strategies are just absolute quackery. There's no reason to, go through all this complicated stuff when you can just solve it in a simple way. But I think part of the agenda is to do exactly what you're describing, Angela, to separate parents from their kids. There's math experts, accountants, and engineers who can't help their second grade kid with their math homework. And that is just absurd. And the purpose is, kids get this idea, oh, okay, my parents are just dummies and I'm just a dummy, but the school can teach me how to do it. And then, and they get their wisdom, they get their education, they get their knowledge from government rather than from their parents and from scripture and from their church. And, it's a huge issue, and we're going to see much more of it. If you look around, if, anybody can go to a search engine and look up, Common Core math, and you'll find a billion examples of this lunacy, or Common Core English, and you'll see them teaching kids that the Second Amendment means that the military has the right to keep and bear arms. There's just, and sex education things. There's so many examples out there of what Common Core is doing. And Angela, I think you just touched on one of the ones that a lot of parents are struggling with.
All right, and thank you for calling, Angela. And I'm going to Nika in Texas. Welcome to Sun Life Broadcasting. You have a quick question for Alex Newman.
What I have is more of a comment. I am a special education self-contained teacher from Texas, and part of my job is to set up the transition tracks that the students go on from high school to the outside world, basically. And what you're talking about today about how we place those kids on tracks and try to dumb them down to what the government tells us to do is basically true. I have had students I've had one that had tremendous artistic talent. He really needed to be on track. He wanted to be an artist. That was what his desire was and his interest. I was told no. He has to do something else, that he's not going to be capable of doing that, even though he was capable. And so I just wanted to speak to that what you're saying is very true. It's happening. Our kids are being placed in what the government wants them to do instead of what they want.
Okay, Alex.
No, thank you so much for that. And I've talked to so many teachers who say, this is what's going on. And parents need to be awake about it. I'm so glad that you called and, just added some more confirmation there to people who might be skeptical. And again, we have, mountains of evidence in the bibliography. If you read nothing else, just read the bibliography in the book, because right there you'll find it right from the primary sources. They're telling us what they're doing. The only problem is that the media hasn't connected the dots. So just read what the education establishment and what the United Nations and what Bill Gates, just read what they're saying. And people will just be blown away. You can't argue with the facts, and the facts are they're saying these things and they're doing these things. So, it's a serious situation we're in.
Exactly. And thank you for calling. Let's go to Karen in Arizona. Karen, welcome to Sun Life Broadcasting.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, and you have a question.
Okay. I really like your program. It's just wonderful in bringing all these truths out. People need to know this. I am a Christian counselor, and I wanted everybody first to know that they're trying to get rid of us too. They do not want us in there. They've thrown us out. They won't let me get a license or do.
Are you talking about a Christian counselor in a school, Karen?
Just any kind of Christian counseling licensing.
Okay, no.
They have people need to compromise or they can't do it. And my question is, why are they doing this? It seems like that they're kind of naive about it because of all the problems that have arisen in the schools recently without realizing that it's the Christian prayer that's been taken out of the schools and the Christian agenda. And I think because of all the problems, they might be trying to do this. What's your opinion on this? Because it's not going to help the rest. It's not going to help the impression for the rest of the world. It's not going to help the education, of people. And America is always trying to be ahead of the education system in the rest of the world. So it's kind of weird.
Yeah. Okay. Alex, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, absolutely. And Scripture confirms exactly what you're saying. We know from Psalm 2, for example, that the kings of the earth conspire against the Lord and his anointed. So this is absolutely an attack on the Christian faith, on the Word of God, on the authority of Scripture, and it's coming from every direction. They're teaching the kindergartners about transgenderism and homosexual so-called marriage and abortion, and they're teaching the kids that it rained on the rocks and they evolved from slime, and the slime turned into a monkey, and the monkey turned into a person. And so there is no morality, there is no God. It's all just nonsense superstition from your parents, and Christian viewpoints are now suddenly hate. If we love our homosexual brethren and tell them, hey, you're in sin, you can't do that. God is not going to accept that. You need to, repent of your sin. Suddenly that's hate. So things we do out of love are being described as hate. They're quite literally indoctrinating the kids to view Christians as hateful, as bigots, as lunatics, as people who believe in these superstitious things. And it's a coordinated attack. And, there's a number of reasons for it. I think the Bible offers the best explanations, but even on the superficial level, Christians and biblical morality are suitable for liberty. If you have a moral people, a Christian people, they can be free. We don't need all kinds of government controls. We have no use for those. And so, it is at a fundamental level an attack on Christianity. And I think what you're witnessing is just one symptom of that. They don't want any Christian message in the school. And they say, oh, it's because of the First Amendment separation of church and state. And that's not even what the First Amendment says. I mean, most people don't know that. But really what it is a direct attack on Christianity. They never, criticize Islam in the school or humanism. All these other religions are totally fine. Hinduism, whatever it is. Just not Christianity. The Christians are hateful, bigots, intolerant, whatever. And, we're going to see much, much more of that in the years ahead. I think they're just getting started.
Well, Homeland Security says that fundamental Christianity, we're actually terrorists. You remember that report that came out, and veterans, and, we're the next terrorists, or we're really the terrorists. Not one thing was said about Islam, Muslims.
Yeah,
and all of it.
I have a slide from a DOD presentation. They were teaching U.S. Army troops. They had a slide on religious extremism. And on this slide, they had evangelical Christians, Catholics, and Orthodox Jews. We're religious extremists now, like Al-Qaeda. So, the government is extremely hostile to Christianity. It's not that they're being unbiased or neutral. This is a deliberate attack, almost a war on Christianity and on the authority of Scripture. And Christians don't even know what's going on. So, how can we fight back if we don't understand that we're under a direct attack by the enemy and by, human forces here on earth?
Yeah. All right. Going to quickly before I go to our next caller, going to an email question. It said, have you heard of Jade Helms 15, which is a military exercise that's going to begin July the 15th? Yes, we have. I've been looking at it very, very closely. They just conducted this same strategy in, I believe it was Fort Lauderdale, Florida. But did you want to say anything about that, Alex?
I've written on it. I think it's something worth watching. The explanation that this is to train for overseas activities doesn't pass the smell test for viewers who aren't familiar with what's going on here. A slide presentation about this exercise was leaked. They have something like 1,200 Special Forces operators in this training exercise. It goes for 2 months, and each of them probably has 10 support staff from my conversations with special operations people, current and retired. And they say this doesn't make any sense. They have Utah and the state of Texas and Southern California painted red, which is hostile territory, insurgent pocket territory. And it's hard to know what they're actually up to, but their explanation doesn't make sense. And I think it's something worth watching at the very least.
Well, is it actually a military exercise, or is it conditioning the American people to get used to policemen rounding up American citizens and take them to jail?
Yeah, the drill that you were talking about in Fort Lauderdale, I mean, the video that came out of that was extremely bizarre, to put it, mildly. You have troops dropping down from helicopters with the, black helicopters and the ski masks and rounding people up and handcuffing them together and putting them up in a big line and working with local law enforcement too, which it would be strange if you're training for overseas operations. You wouldn't have a sheriff that is going to be friendly to your cause. So there's a lot there to be concerned about. I think Christians need to really be aware of what's going on. And Francis, you're doing such a great job on just shining the light on these things. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you on the program. I really appreciate you consenting to being on. Let me ask you another question here real quick. This one is from the United Kingdom, Alex. And he said that we have an all-parties campaign on the general election coming up. And education is a key point with all the political parties. We start school here very young, at the age of 3, and then the kids are in school until they're 18. Then it's colleges and universities, if you can't afford it. And most of the kids that come out of the school system cannot afford it. Education is then out of the grasp of the people. My point is, these children are leaving school. They can't even read or write. You're in school all of these years from the age of 3 till the age of 18. And yet, when you graduate, you can't read and you can't write. What are these teachers teaching during all that time? They're failing exams, and these politicians are patting each other on the backs. Alex, this is from the United Kingdom, of course, but it's basically what's happening over there is happening here.
That's right. And it's such an indictment of the school system. I taught my 4-year-old how to read using phonics in a matter of weeks for $20. I just bought a book. And, it's a very simple thing. Kids are easy to teach to read because their minds are just ready for it. They want to absorb that information. But then here you have these schools that are spending, $200,000 per student over the course of, their full primary and secondary education. And they're graduating and they can't read their high school diploma. It's a total indictment of the education system and the education establishment that this is going on. It's a disgrace and it's an embarrassment. And it's, I think, very strong evidence. The solid evidence is there, but it's very strong anecdotal evidence that this is all deliberate. If a parent can teach a 4-year-old to read in a few weeks, how could a government school system with all this money and all these resources fail to do it in 15 years? It's no accident.
That's exactly right. We're going to Barbara in Texas. So, Barbara, you have a question.
I have a comment, please.
Okay.
In the late 70s, I read a copy of the Humanist Manifesto of 1939. It was signed in Bulgaria. I don't remember the signatories, but one of the main points was to get children out of the home by the age of 3 into state-run daycare, to remove them from the influence of their parents' religious faith and their attitudes, to keep them from having family unity, no patriotism. That was a very important point. And this just certainly facilitates all the brainwashing they want to do once they actually get to school. And thank you so much for all you do. You're keeping us informed. I live in an area where they're going to have that JTELM 15, and we're close to a National Guard base.
Oh, really?
So that's something else. Well, all that's been in the papers so far is, we're going to have a meeting with the city council, and everybody's invited, and this is just what you said, training. And I'm really scared. I'm not afraid of being hurt, really, but just the whole concept is pretty scary.
Yeah.
But again, thank you so much for all you do. I appreciate you. I tell everybody I know to watch your show.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Alex, would you like to comment on what Barbara said?
Yeah, that's the nail on the head right there. I mentioned at the beginning of the program that John Dewey, the architect of our progressive education system that's plaguing the whole country, was one of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto. So it's no surprise that all of these wacky ideas, that parents are bad for their kids and the government needs to take over the duty of parenting so that we can move toward a secular, atheistic, humanistic, collectivist society. It's no surprise that, if the architect of that was a signatory on this Humanist Manifesto, that we would see exactly that coming to pass. And I encourage everybody to read the manifesto. It's startling. And then when you realize that the so-called founding father of the current government education system was a signatory, if that doesn't ring alarm bells, we have problems.
Right. Back in 1985, my husband wrote a book entitled The Rape of a Nation. And I've had so many people write to me that I told him the other day I want to get that book back in print because he was writing about humanism and the infiltration into our school systems and our nation as a whole. And this is from somebody here in our church, and she says in that book, said he was talking about humanism, but it's actually Common Core. And you would be shocked at how up to date. It was written in 1985. Just writing on humanism, it's exactly what we see happening today. Going to bring that back into print. I can assure you of that. But quickly, we have time for Bruce in Pennsylvania. Bruce, you have a quick question.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
And God bless y'all. Ma'am, I'm a grandparent and a patriot, and my question is, fundamentally, is this not basically the same mechanisms that were used by Hitler to indoctrinate the young people back in the late 30s. And I shall hang up and listen for your answer.
All right,
God
Alex,
bless
I'm gonna
y'all.
let you. Yeah, I'm gonna let you answer, Bruce.
Yeah, that's actually exactly right. And it's even more troubling than I think it appears on the surface. If you look at some of the influences on these progressive utopian educators that seize control of our government schools, there's a lot of links back to Germany. Wundt at the University of Leipzig was one of the kind of philosophers who inspired a lot of this behavioral psychology, treating children as kind of animals to be molded and sculpted that we have in our schools today. And, it's when you think about it in that sense, it's exactly what's going on. It's the same strategy. And every dictator, every dictatorship has understood, and a lot of them have been open about it. You need to control the minds of the children if you want to implement your wicked system. Otherwise, you can't do it. If you have Christian parents raising Christian children, it just won't work. It's not possible. And so they realized early on that you need to seize control of the education system. And we saw that in National Socialist Germany. We saw it in the Soviet Union. We saw it in Mao's China. We see it everywhere where tyranny emerges. And to go back to the humanism thing real quick, humanism by itself sounds benign, right? It's logic and reason. But think about what the snake said to Eve in the garden. You can be like God. And the humanists are essentially saying there is no God. Man is God, and reason is God. And we're going to worship reason and humanity and science. Think about what the snake told Eve back in the garden, and you'll see that there's a lot more going on than meets the eye on the surface here.
Yes, very much. A lot more going on. And today our special guest has been Alex Newman. And I want to say, Alex, it has been such a pleasure to meet you formally and to have you on the program with me today. And it won't be the last. I hope you'll consent to come back and be with us. You've been a very special guest today. I'm sure you take speaking engagements, so forth and so on. Would you like to share about your book and speaking engagements, or maybe you're going to be around somewhere close that some of the people could go to in their areas?
Sure. Thank you so much, Francis. God bless you. I really appreciate you having me on, and I'm happy to come on anytime. Just get in touch. The book is called Crimes of the Educators, How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. And again, we use the primary source material here so that it can't be disputed. There's no theories. This is straight from the horse's mouth. As far as speaking engagements, I'm always willing to go do speaking engagements, anywhere. I have a few coming up, one in Florida, one in Wisconsin. People can stay tuned to WND or, other places, and they can see what's coming up. And if anybody, has an interest in having me come to their town and speak, I'm always open to that. So just, get in touch and we'll make a plan. And thank you so much again, Francis. God bless.
And thank you for being with us today. Very interesting what this gentleman had to say, and I appreciate so much him being on the air with us. And I thank Brother Smith and Jim Nations for being with us today. We're going to have to close down the program today, but we will be back with you Monday morning, 9 a.m., another great program. You don't want to miss these programs. I have some special guests that's going to be with us Monday. What we're going to be discussing, you're going to be very, very, very interested in, as well as other times, and we are constantly out there. And, Fox News says we're looking out for you. We really are looking out for you, trying to give you all the information that you need. We love you, and God bless you.
Email questions and comments about today's program to onair@jsm.org. Be sure to join Francis Swaggart on Facebook at facebook.com/Francis Swaggart. Archived programs are available at sunlifetv.com. Francis and Friends is a production of the Sun Life Broadcasting Network.